Thank the gentleman for his testimony. Any questions or comments of the member?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much once again. And now I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, for 5 minutes.
Thank you and good morning, Chairman Yomuth, Ranking Member Womack, members of this committee. Thank you for having us here today. This committee is tasked with the important constitutional obligation placed on Congress in Article 1, Section 8 to determine how much revenue should be collected from the taxpayers and how much should be spent. The budget process is vital because it's within that budget framework that we evaluate proposed legislation to ensure that we're spending within agreed upon spending limits, or at least that's how it's supposed to work. Last year, I came to talk to you about a bill I introduced, H.R. 638, the Cost Estimates Improvement Act, which would require the CBO and JCT to include debt servicing costs in their estimates. I asked you to include it as part of the fiscal year 2020 budget process. We do not have the luxury of ignoring the true cost of our spending decisions. Our nation's outstanding debt is nearly $23.4 trillion and climbing, and by the time we meet this time next year in this committee, it'll be over $24 trillion. In fact, according to the most recent budget outlook from CBO, over the next 10 years, the annual deficits will reach $1.7 trillion. Our national debt will reach nearly $35 trillion, and our annual interest payments will be $819 billion. These numbers are so big that it's hard for the average person to comprehend, but they represent a real threat to our nation's financial future. And we are increasing the deficits and debt at these alarming rates without a full and complete picture of the legislation we're voting on because we regularly do not consider the interest cost. As Maya McGinnis of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget explains, if the interest on the debt is not counted, the official scores of legislation can be deceptively low, especially when offsets would occur years in the future. American taxpayers and future generations deserve honest accounting, not more gimmicks that attempt to paper over our huge and unsustainable deficits. The folks back home understand this. If they were budgeting for a monthly car payment and only considered the list price of the car itself and didn't factor in the extra cost of the interest payments, they might discover later that the actual cost was more than they could afford. In essence, Congress does this very same thing by not considering the comprehensive budgetary impact of spending and taxing proposals. This distorts congressional decision-making in favor of more spending and debt accumulation than might otherwise be the case. Simply put, the debt servicing costs in legislative cost estimates would better equip lawmakers to make informed spending decisions. My legislation also does one more important thing that would help lawmakers make better spending decisions. It requires cost estimates to include a list of duplicative programs with the covered legislation. For example, the President's budget documents released earlier this month noted that there are 91 federal programs to train healthcare professionals, and this is just one example of duplication across the federal government. If cost estimates were required to point out such duplication, it might give members pause before voting to spend more taxpayer dollars on duplicative programs, and it would give us a better awareness toward evaluating and improving current programs. But the good news is that while legislation requiring consideration of interest cost is preferred, we do not need it we do not need legislation to pass in order for us to begin counting the real cost of proposed legislation. CBO is already capable of producing these numbers, and you have the power to ask for it in this committee. Last month, I sent a letter to the chairman and ranking member, as well as your counterparts in the U.S. Senate, a bipartisan letter signed by myself and 56 of our colleagues. In the letter, we ask that you direct the CBO to begin including debt servicing costs in all legislative cost estimates produced. Reining in our debt and our deficits only gets harder the longer we wait, and we owe it to our constituents, particularly those of future generations, to make spending decisions with the most accurate information possible. This isn't a red or blue issue, a Republican or a Democrat issue. This is just simple good governance. I hope that you'll consider this cost estimates reform as an important step toward improving our budget process, and I do thank you again for your time here today. Appreciate it.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. Any questions or comments?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, thank you. My colleague is exactly right. This isn't a red or blue issue. This is just common sense that every American, every business has to go through, everywhere, every state, everywhere except the federal government. we found many of those kind of things. And I think if you polled everybody individually, they would tell you the same thing. And why we can't do it, it's beyond me. I'm going to find the answer, though.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Well,